So Melanie, you're going to.
Good morning and welcome to today's research seminar on clean transportation access disparities in California. My name is Melanie Zauscher and I'm a manager at the California Air Resources Board. Before we get started with the presentation, I want to provide some housekeeping notes and set the context. The seminar is being recorded and will be posted online soon. Please use the chat feature to post your questions during the seminar. Clarifying questions will be answered during the presentation. You'll be able to ask your questions verbally after the presentation during the time we've reserved for this purpose as well. This study is an important component of CARB's broader sustainable communities research, which supports our efforts to reduce emissions to help meet California's climate and air quality goals. It also informs our policies to create healthier communities to achieve environmental and health equity across California. This study was motivated to support CARB's work related to Senate Bill 350. This legislation directed CARB to identify barriers that low-income Californians face in accessing clean transportation and mobility options and strategies to overcome these barriers. In 2018, CARB published its study, which underscored the need to measure and track clean transportation access so that California can evaluate progress and identify where targeted efforts may be needed. This research project was envisioned to address this need by creating both a methodology and a mapping tool for measuring transportation access disparity across the state. As we scoped this project, it evolved to include other social determinants of health that are closely linked to transportation and access metrics, such as economic, environmental, and social demographic conditions. This study was also envisioned to advance CARB's overarching equity efforts. The research objectives recognize that clean transportation access is an important driver for health because it facilitates access to jobs, schools, healthcare, and healthy food, and it contributes to quality of life. Furthermore, access to clean transportation reduces the likelihood that outcomes of the transportation system, such as air pollution, will negatively impact health. The goal of applied research like this project is to help state, regional, and local agencies determine where improvements can and should occur to make progress towards achieving environmental and health equity. I am delighted to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Paul Ong is a research professor at the University of California, Los Angeles Luskin School of Public Affairs and director of the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. He is trained as an economist and an urban planner. His research focuses on how mismatches in the urban spatial structure and the transportation system produce economic, educational, and environmental inequalities among ethnic and racial groups. Professor Ong has served as an expert advisor for numerous governmental agencies, community and legal organizations, and foundations. His many publications include a recent book, An Even Urbanscape, Spatial Structures and Ethno-Racial Inequality. Before we move on to the presentation, I would like to sincerely thank the whole research team for all the dedication to this study. The work on this project began in early 2019, so this seminar is the culmination of many years of effort. I also want to acknowledge and thank all the collaborators that helped make this study successful, including many colleagues at CARB in various state and regional agencies and nonprofit organizations. Finally, I would also like to sincerely thank the members of the advisory committee for this project. With that, I'd like to pass it off to Professor Ong for his presentation.
Thank you, and we'll get started on the presentation. First, I want to thank CARB as well as our research team for their contribution and support of this effort. It's been over 2 years, but I think we have produced something that is incredibly useful to a number of stakeholders. Next slide, please. as mentioned, the purpose of this project really is to develop indicators that allow stakeholders to identify the causes, characteristic, consequences of transportation disparities at the neighborhood level. And for us, the neighborhood level is proxied by census tracts. As mentioned earlier, this supports CARB's equity initiative within climate change efforts and efforts to address the environmental problems that we're facing. The project is not really just a research effort. It really is about creating information that's accessible to public agencies and other stakeholders who are working to ensure fairness and equity as we move forward in terms of addressing climate change, as well as in terms of coordinating that with transportation policies. Next slide, please. This lists the major tasks that was part of the project. And the first and most important one in terms of framing this is getting stakeholder input into this process. That included forming an advisory committee, as well as soliciting input from experts, practitioners, and general broad outreach so we could develop a product that is most useful for the stakeholders. In terms of actually what we did is that we worked with this input to identify and prioritize the data indicators that would be included. And that's based, again, on these inputs, but as well as looking at the literature, as well as looking at how people think about the causal models. And that allows us to prioritize which indicators we could use our resources to develop. The process, which is task 3 of data assembly and construction, is multiple step, certainly extracting and accessing the data, and then constructing new indicators when needed. But we also wanted to make sure the quality of the data is there. So as a major part of the data is data assessment. We use the final set of data and put it into a screening tool. And that will be presented in terms of a data and mapping portal. And that data mapping portal allows users as ways to both access the data and have some functions to assess the data as well as download the data. We will have a final report which is now posted and will be available for the details of the information. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, a critical important component is getting input from stakeholders. This is a list of the agencies that we included on the committee or solicited input from. They include a large number of state agencies, regional agencies, as well as transportation interest groups. Next slide, please. In terms of data assembly and construction, we extracted information from publicly available data, specialized data from the public agency, as well as data from non-public entities. So we believe that there's no single source of data that will answer everything we need to answer. And we took this approach of tapping multiple data sources. The data were assessed in terms of its quality, timeliness, precision, accuracy, and consistency across different sources. We use both spatial and aspatial tools to construct metrics. For example, using spatial tools to enhance and modify the measure of availability of nearby parks to neighborhood residents. We started with, for example, the indicators developed by Parks and Recs, but we also made adjustments for what we felt were important components that currently is not available. An important part is evaluating our indicators to see how they compare to similar pre-existing ones. This allows us to get a better understanding about our contribution as well as the quality of the information and the appropriateness of the information. The data is quite often ranked for the metrics where appropriate. And we use this ranking as a way of not producing information with false precision, and also as a way to visualize information. It's important for us to really understand that some of this data have limitation, and therefore presenting it in great detail is not appropriate. So precision and visualization becomes very important guide points. We report some of the indicators in deciles. You can find that in the report. For the data mapping portal, we use quintiles because that's a better way of presenting the information. Next slide, please. We had two types of indicators. It's two major parts. One is the set of indicators that are new and constructed by CNK, the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. The other one are indicators we took directly from other data sources. This slide shows the indicators that we constructed that are new. They are not just a reporting of other people's information. And it's organized in this list along some of the major concepts that we think about, measures of accessibility. For example, we have a job housing fit. That comes out of the concept that ideally we would like to have affordable housing where the jobs have lower wages. And one of the problems we're facing quite often in terms of sustainability and travel is that where a number of jobs, lower paying jobs, don't have nearby affordable housing, and that adds to travel. So that's an example of accessibility. There are other indicators of accessibilities on this list. We also want to understand the causes in terms of lack of private transportation resources. And here we're really talking about access to vehicles and automobiles. Unfortunately, what we know from the literature is that the opportunity to own a vehicle, clean vehicles included, are things such as huge variations in insurance premium, even after you adjust for characteristics and coverage. And so that's a barrier. There's also barriers in terms of lending and borrowing. And high interest rates quite often are concentrated in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. We also have our own construction of a health indicator in terms of traffic collision. There's a number of neighborhood indicator that gives us a sense of the characteristics of the neighborhood that's relevant. For example, job density is one of the major indicators of sustainability. And we also had special indicators by neighborhoods based on the regional median, average median income. And that adjusts for differences in cost of living as well as differences in wage levels. Finally, what's core to this study are indicators about transportation and travel. The most important one, or at least one of the most important one, is looking at the distribution of newer clean vehicles. Those are the ones that were on the market the last few years, as well as clunkers, the high pollution vehicles. And finally, VMT per household. And we also have VMT for commuters. So travel, average travel for workers, as well as overall average travel for households. Next slide, please. These are indicators that we took directly from other sources, in some cases with some minor modification, but this provides us a detailed more details on health, housing, the social, economic, and demographic characteristics, travel patterns in terms of transportation. So that complements our newly constructed indicators. Next slide, please. So I want to run through a couple of examples of the spatial or geographic patterns. And one thing is that what we're doing is we're in many ways documenting the magnitude of the differences. Many of these differences are well known to our stakeholders, so they will not find the pattern surprising. But what's important, particularly if you want evidence-based policies and programs, is quantify those differences. So there are three that I would like to illustrate to you. One is average VMT per household, and that was constructed using a number of neighborhood level data sources, so we could directly observe VMT. The other one is the percentage of the vehicle stock that is comprised of clean vehicles. And finally, access to bikeways. The latter is important because we want to promote active transportation. What I'm going to show you is a series of maps that are first for California, then zoomed in to the Bay Area and Los Angeles. Next slide, please. So here's the slide and the map of average VMT per household statewide. And what you see clearly visible is that the rural areas tend to have higher average VMT, whereas the urban core have lower average VMT. And this is not surprising given the spatial structure of homes and employment. In the rural areas, they're much more geographically dispersed, whereas in the core urban area, they're denser and closer together. So there's this tight relationship between average VMT and the characteristics in terms of rural areas versus the more core urban areas. Next slide, please. When we zoom in the Bay Area, what you see is that the core urban areas, the highly dense areas in San Francisco and on the East Bay, on the western edge of the East Bay, those tend to have much lower VMT, whereas the suburban areas and the exurban areas farther out have higher VMT. Next slide. And we see similar types of patterns here in Los Angeles. In the denser areas running from downtown through the Wilshire corridor out to Santa Monica, those are areas that tend to have much lower VMT, not surprisingly. And again, we find in the suburbs and exurbs higher average VMT. Next slide, please. Here's the slides for the percentage of the vehicle stock in a neighborhood that's comprised of clean vehicles. And what you see is that along the more affluent coastal areas, that there are a higher percentage of clean vehicles. And whereas poorer areas have much lower. Again, not a surprising pattern. What we're doing is really adding additional information in terms of the magnitude of the variations across neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Here is an example in terms of the Bay Area. And the Bay Area has historically been a place with overall high percentage of clean vehicles. The pattern is not as sharp in terms of within the Bay Area distinction between the core area and the more suburban areas. And in part, the suburban areas offset some of the other factors because they are higher income areas. Next slide, please. This is Los Angeles, and what you see here is what we call the classical donut shape in Los Angeles. In the center, the core urban area, which tend to be poor and people of color, you see very low percentage of that vehicle stock made up of clean vehicle. Whereas along the coast and in the Santa Monica Hills and farther to the east, these are more affluent areas, and there you see a higher percentage of clean vehicles. Again, not surprising, but what this does is add quantitative and empirical evidence to what we know. Next slide, please. If we look at availability of bikeways per population, what you see is a pattern. Well, first thing you see is that we don't have complete data. A number of counties, MPOs, don't have complete information in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of bikeway. And that's something that we need to work on eventually to fill out the state. But for the data that we have, it's not a necessarily easy pattern you could see at the state level. And you see, for example, in some rural areas, high rates of bikeways. In some rural areas, you don't see that. The same for some of the urban areas. Next slide, please. So when we zoom in, we might be able to see a pattern that shows up in a much better way. And so what you see, for example, in San Francisco, that the high bikeway areas are essentially in the more recreational area, in the north tip of it, around the Presidio and the marina. You know, they have bikeways there. And you see also in Golden Gate Park and parts of the western edge along the shoreline to the ocean. So these tend to be areas that tend to serve more recreational biking. And there is, unfortunately, quite often in the core urban area, not as much in terms of available bikeways. Next slide, please. And similar sort of patterns here in Los Angeles, where you see a higher availability of bikeways is along the coastal areas in the South Bay, but in many of the inner city core urban neighborhoods, you don't see bikeways being available. Next slide, please. So this data illustration of how we use this data is to understand how resources are distributed and how it is different across different types of neighborhood. One important distinction in terms of different types of neighborhoods is by income level. And so we categorize each tract, each neighborhood by their ranking relative to the regional medium income. And we have 4 categories that we call lowest income, low income, middle income, and high income. There are 2 things that we want to show. One is are there differences across the categories of income and income classes? And then within each income categories, do we see heterogeneity, differences? Next slide, please. So here is the slide for BMT. Each of the income class in terms of neighborhood classification is divided into quintiles according to whether they fall into the highest VMT category or the lowest VMT category. It's easily to see visually that the average VMT in affluent neighborhoods is much higher than those in the poor neighborhoods. And not surprising, income, wealth is related to your ability to travel, to cover the cost of travel, to cover the cost of owning vehicles. But we also should notice that even within an income category, there's heterogeneity. For example, in the most affluent neighborhoods, we have neighborhoods with very low VMT. And for the poorest neighborhood, we also have, though not huge numbers, but we also have neighborhoods that generate high VMT. Next slide, please. This is the illustration of new clean vehicles as a proportion of the vehicle stock. And again, what we see is, not surprisingly, affluent neighborhoods have a higher rate. You could see that sort of visually just by looking at the relative density or proportion in the highest category. It's particularly pronounced among the neighborhoods in the highest income categories. Whereas in low income neighborhoods, again, not surprisingly, there are far fewer neighborhoods with a fair number of new clean vehicles. That being said, it's still important to understand that each of these income categories, there's still a considerable amount of heterogeneity in terms of some neighborhoods within the same income class having a high proportion of clean vehicles and many neighborhoods having a low proportion. Next slide, please. And again, when we look at bikeways, not surprisingly, it looks in many ways similar to the patterns we saw in terms of VMT and clean vehicles. Distinctive differences across the different income classes, but also heterogeneity within each income class. Next slide, please. So our major sort of findings from this sort of distributional analysis is that low-income neighborhoods experience several challenges. There are more barriers to vehicle ownership, disproportionately fewer clean vehicles, and more clunkers, less ability to travel, that is lower VMT, and less access to infrastructure to support active transportation. But also we find diversity of transportation characteristics even within categories, indicating that California has a rather complex and highly heterogeneous neighborhood system. One of the policy and programmatic implication is that we need to go beyond a simple one-size-fit approach in terms of promoting equity. A practical solution should be customized to the particular characteristics, opportunities in each places. Next slide, please. We have been able to use some of this data in terms of further understanding inequality. I'll give you 3 examples. One is that we completed a project comparing access to opportunities, education and otherwise, in Los Angeles and in San Joaquin. And this gives us an insight into how urban and rural counties may differ in terms of the pattern of accessibility to opportunities. Certainly there are commonalities between the 2 counties, but there are also very distinctive patterns. That's the geographic variation that ought to be considered in any policy and program. We're currently conducting an analysis of the location of affordable housing and changes in the location of affordable housing. Right now, focusing on Section 8 vouchers. Relative to sustainability and transportation characteristics, are affordable housing changing and moving into areas that are better in terms of transportation, accessibility, sustainability, as well as the other indicators that we want to promote well-being of those in affordable housing, such as access to employment, also in an environment that's safe and clean. So this data, along with other data, allows us to get a better sense of what's happening in the affordable housing sector. Finally, a third example is that we've been working with some community organizations and transportation groups around improving bikeway infrastructure and safety in the Los Angeles South Bay communities. The data that we have from this project was a starting point. As in many projects, what we're able to do for this data set is limited. It certainly gives you a broad overview, a starting point, but it needs to be augmented by other information in terms of developing programs and approaches and interventions. So these are just 3 examples in terms of how this data can be used, being used, and hopefully will be used in the future. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn now to my colleague Chandora Pesh, who will present and give a quick demonstration of the data mapping portal. This is the way we provide stakeholders access to the data that I've been talking about, and so they could use it for their own purposes. Chan?
Thanks, Paul. I just want to make sure that everybody could see the web map.
Yes.
Yes, great. So what I'm going to do is provide you with a quick demo of the data mapping tool that we developed for this project. The data mapping portal includes over 40 indicators, and they're grouped into 5 different major categories as shown here: transportation, accessibility, socioeconomic and demographics, housing, and health. If you click on each of the 5 tabs, you will see a list of indicators. For example, under accessibility, you can find the availability of bikeway indicators that Paul was talking about earlier. And under transportation, as another example, you can find the average BMT indicator. To the left panel of the data mapping portal, you're provided with brief descriptions of each of the indicators and additional more detailed information, including the methodology and how the indicator was constructed overall, can be found in the larger report, which we'll drop a link to in the chat box. And CARB is also working on uploading the report and the data mapping portal onto their website. Almost all of the indicators, as Paul mentioned, are for this data mapping portal are visually presented in quintiles. So that's 5 categories from highest to lowest of that particular indicator, with each bin roughly having the same number of tracks in each of the quintiles. There's also a number of widgets that I do want to go over. To the left panel here, you could see of the map, you could see an address bar, which you can input your address or place, and it will take you to that particular location. There's also a zoom in and zoom out buttons. The plus sign here is for zooming in, and the minus sign here is for zooming out. You can also use your scroll wheel on your mouse to zoom in and zoom out. The home button will take you back to just the extent of the map, which shows all of California. So there are also pop-up windows. So here I am just zooming into Los Angeles, where you can click on a particular track and it would provide you with information about the track itself. There's the track number, the ranking of that particular indicator, and the ranking relative to all other tracks in California. And then there's some neighborhood characteristics included in the pop-up window, which such as total population, some demographic and socioeconomic characteristics here. Back up here. So on the right side panel of the widgets, there are, this is the legend widget. The second widget is the layer widget, which includes boundaries that you could check on and off for different geographies. So for example, here's a boundary for MPOs. And there's also other ones that you could check on and off. You can also play around with the transparency of each indicator by clicking on the 3 little circles right here to the right corner and clicking on transparency. And you can make it darker or lighter depending on how you want it to look. Then I also want to talk about the filter query. So what the map allows you to do is that you can actually filter by either geography, particular neighborhood characteristics, and also you can also filter by other indicators that were constructed for this project. So with the filter tool, for example, you can filter by just looking at the disadvantaged neighborhoods, and that's designated by SB 535. And you got to make sure you turn on the toggle to the right here. And so here, what we see here is the VMT distribution, but only for those neighborhoods that are designated as disadvantaged neighborhoods by SB 535. There is also a spatial query tool, which you could actually use to draw different shapes to select tracks. So here I'm just using one of the drawing tool to draw a circle around some selected tracks. And if you click on apply, it should select those tracks for you. And it highlights those tracks actually. And the feature here, you could actually export this data set or the selected features to a CSV file. There's also a tool, or there's also an attribute table towards the bottom of the map where you could actually download the data as well. Right here. So you can see here, when you zoom out, it will populate all the different selections. And this is another area where you could actually download or export the data as a CSV file. And it includes all the different attributes that it's included in the data set. So the indicator and then all the different neighborhood characteristics. There is a couple more widgets. One is just for the base map widget, which allows you to change different base map if you want to look at a different base map. And then there's also the print widget. And what the print widget does is that it allows you pretty much to just print the map. And you could print it as a PDF file or image file. So that's just a quick demo. I'm going to turn it back actually to Paul for closing.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to have a couple of concluding remarks as well as recommendations of how to move forward. Again, the database and mapping tool was created by this project to really allow stakeholders, public agencies, and others to explore the causes, patterns, and consequences of transportation inequality across neighborhoods. And we believe that information is very useful for a number of purposes. Clearly developing more evidence-based and effective policies and programs, but also using the tool in terms of developing interventions and actions that are specific to the needs of each disadvantaged neighborhood to realize, again, what I present in terms of distribution analysis is that even among poor neighborhoods, there's considerable differences in heterogeneity in travel, transportation patterns. Next slide, please. So we have a few recommendations. To make this tool really usable and to expand how it's applied, we think it's important to develop workshops for public agencies and other stakeholders in terms of how to use the data portal, as well as how they could use information from the data portal in terms of applying it to some analysis, for example, to identify particular types of neighborhoods that might qualify for certain interventions or programs, or use it as a way of helping and contributing to ranking, prioritizing which neighborhoods ought to receive assistance, and also using this data over time to monitor changes that are important. The second recommendation, which sort of builds on monitoring changes, is important to think about how to regularly update the data so we can monitor changes over time. We also need to expand and refine the indicators. I saw in the chat a number of suggestions about what additional information and data point could be included And I agree with those recommendations. And so one of the things that CARB ought to really think about in terms of the next iteration is how do we get input in terms of expanding and refining some of the indicators. A major task will be moving from the 2010 tracks that were used for this project into the 2020 tracks based on the last decennial enumeration. And one of the things is also begin adopting some standardized analytical tools and making composite metrics that can be used to assess where the transportation gap is being closed over time. It's important to understand that these tools are useful, particularly when we're talking about work done by the MPOs and local jurisdictions that from a state level, consistency in those tools are important. We also understand that there are huge differences across different types and different regions of the state. For example, that's why we did the study comparing Los Angeles and San Joaquin in terms of accessibility. And we need to be sensitive to those differences, but at the same time, we need to have analytical tools that are comparable across regions so we could understand what's happening at the state level. So those are our recommendations. Next slide, please. And here is information in terms of how you could access the report as well as the data mapping portal. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. I can't we'll try to be as responsive as possible. Now I want to turn it back to Melanie, who's going to guide us through any questions and hopefully will give you useful answers.
Thank you so much for the presentation and the demo of the tool. And I see that there's many questions in the chat. So I'm just going to start going through some and asking some folks who've posted questions if you wanted to ask them so I don't have to read them all. So I'm going to start with you, Colin Fisk.
Thanks. Yeah. So first of all, thank you for presentation. Really appreciate it. And I guess, I work for an organization in a more rural part of the state up on the North Coast. And we do a lot of work in small towns where, neighborhoods are divided at a finer scale than the tract level. And I know there's a lot of data constraints in working at, block group and smaller levels, but I wonder whether there's any ability to quantify transportation disparities at a smaller level that would be more useful to us in a lot of circumstances. Thanks.
The answer is yes and no. I hate being a faculty member or an economist, one hand on the other hand. The answer is it depends on the metrics and the indicators. For example, a number of these can go down to much smaller geographies than census tracts. The information on the vehicle stock is really taken from the DMV, and the VMT is approximated by using bar data. That's where you do your emissions. And that provides information on the last odometer reading, current odometer readings. Those are all in the basic data set at the address level. So you could certainly geocode it into different geographies. The same is true for a number of these indicators that the basic data, fundamental data, is at a very low level. So the answer is that it really depends. If you look at bikeways, for example, that is just essentially in GIS line segments, and you could divide that up. So you can get down to smaller geographies for a number of these indicators. It's just a question of time and resources to do that. There are some indicators that would be very difficult. For example, data from the American Community Survey is reported at the block group level. But when we get down to that level, what we call the standard error becomes large relative to the reporting of that information. So we need to be very careful about how we use data that does not have the precision because they're based on a sample and therefore they're standard errors. That's certainly a exercise that could be done to see what is possible for different geographies. For this project, since this is an initial project to do this, we settled on census tracts because that quite often is a common geographic area for small areas that people use. And there's no reason to necessarily stay at that level.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to ask Brett Zoyner, apologies for mispronouncing your last name, if you can unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Yes, my question was about whether or not the data layers, the shape files, would be available on ArcGIS Online. And I guess similarly, in a similar vein, in terms of the tool as it is now, is there any goal or desire to make it so that we can add additional layers to the tool while we're working within it? I worked with a team and we created a kind of CalEnviroScreen type tool for the state of Michigan. And that was something after community feedback that we included, was just the ability, and I believe it's very simple, but maybe it's like a CARB decision or UCLA decision, but to be able to, search through the database of available shape files on ArcGIS and be able to add them in the tool in real time would be helpful, as well as the other way around, being able to add these layers to other mapping tools, say like CalEnviroScreen. And somebody else had asked about the EV chargers, and I'm sure there's a reason why EV charging infrastructure was left off of the tool, but what I guess I'm proposing would help address that, because we could just add the EV charging layers to the tool in real time and be able to do that analysis. So thank you.
Yeah, all excellent proposals and ideas. And I fully support what you're saying. And I do know that there is a way of developing a mapping tool where you could add your own data on top of the existing ones. Going back, in terms of the shape files, we use pretty much standard shape files, so they're readily available. In terms of adding additional layers, that could certainly be done. It could be point data. And so for another project we did with the Department of Public Health, we used point data on all of the healthcare facilities as well as services for people living with HIV. So they're using that as a tool for their policy planning in terms of moving forward. So all you're saying, I think, are great ideas. The real constraint is around resources and time. So each of these take a bit of time to add, a bit of time to test to make sure it's working well and so forth. Ultimately, we had a list of probably potential indicators that was at least 3 times or more longer than what we finally ended up with. And we ended up with ones that were guided by certainly the literature about what's important, but also input from the stakeholders. So in some ways, it'd be hard to be completely comprehensive given limited resources. In terms of moving forward, the plan is that the data portal that we have up is not considered permanently. CARB will be putting up their own version of this, and maybe they could add some additional enhancement, but that's a call by CARB. In terms of moving forward, in terms of adding additional information, I think that would be great. And so the comments you're saying, partly I could answer what we're currently doing, but certainly they could be very useful when CARB puts this up on their own website.
Thank you so much. And yeah, that was my idea, was to add the electric vehicle chargers as point data, and that would be really insightful. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you for that question. Next question will be from Steve Polson. Apologies again for mispronouncing your name.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for the presentation today. My question related to when you or how you might expect to be able to update the data sets on VMT to reflect kind of post-COVID and post the shift to telework and e-commerce and communication substitution, such that the fundamental relationships of travel and distance and density, et cetera, reflect those changes that we've been seeing. Thank you.
So the answer is, let me answer first it technically, and then we could talk about the feasibility. So technically, the method we have will take a bit of time. It lags behind because it is based on a core part, two core part of it is the vehicle stock that our CARB gets from the Department of Motor Vehicle, and the emission testing, which doesn't cover every vehicle. It covers generally older vehicles every other year. And so those are data sets that take a bit of time to gather, process, and so forth. So it would take a bit of time to really understand the impact of the pandemic and post-pandemic travel patterns. That being said, the alternative is, there are other alternatives that analysts have been looking at, including us. So we've been looking at, for example, big data. These are smartphone data sets in terms of travel patterns. There's a couple of major vendors that we've been working with. We published some work based on that. That gives us more closer real-time data in terms of changes in travel patterns, and including travel distances and so forth. One needs to be very careful with that data because it has lots of built-in biases that we're trying to understand and make adjustment for. So in terms of if the need is to understand in a quicker way what's happening in terms of the pandemic, I would say that the method we use would not be appropriate. It still has its usefulness, but we would have to look at other sorts of data set that's more immediate in terms of reporting. So I think those are technically possible. Whether it's feasible and implemented, that's going to be a call made by CARB. And I'm not sure if Marlene wants to add anything about CARB's plans going into the future.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just briefly say that we think it's a useful tool, but we want to see how it's being used and make sure that it is being used before we decide to make any decisions to support further updates. We also know that a lot of other sibling state agencies or other groups are also working to identify and develop transportation-related metrics. And so if we can find a way that align, work together, and not have multiple tools that aren't, minimize the resources instead of working on something together. So we're open to collaborations and making sure that this is useful before we make any decisions moving forward and how to update it. But ideally, we do update it every 4 to 5 years. We'll see what we end up doing with the tool. All right. So I was gonna.
Thank you.
Thank you. So next, I was going to ask Colin Clark to ask his question.
Hi there, thank you. This is great work. Thank you so much. This was, I guess my first comment in the chat was very small, detailed in nature in terms of the technical use of the tool. It sounds like we can use the tool to manually draw a boundary to stay in the same geographic boundaries and be able to compare across indicators. But if we but I'm not sure if it works that way. If I tried it by zip code or county or something like that, every time you click on a new indicator, it goes back to the statewide view.
I think that's a question Chan is better able to answer, but one of the things I believe is when you select your geography, the data point dropdown will include the different indicators. Chan?
Yeah, so I think you might have to refresh your page. I have to actually, try that myself to double check whether I'm getting or trying to figure out what you're asking in terms of, is it zooming back out or?
Maybe this is something we could.
It zooms out to statewide, exactly.
Why don't we do this rather than getting into this detail right now and try to figure it out, is that we will take a look at it. We will report back to CARB. I know CARB will be putting up a version of this on their own website, and maybe that's something that they could address if there's a problem. How's that? I apologize if I don't know if we should try to handle these more technical things right now. Okay, great.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Yes. Thank you. D.Y. Lee, I think you had also a question or two. Oh, no audio. All right. So the first question was about internalizing EV charging infrastructure, which we've already discussed a little bit. So I don't know if there's anything else to add. I think yeah, obviously EV charging is important to CARB and to other state agencies. So this would just be something that we'd have to do in the future. And then the other question was about including energy burden aspects. So I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to think about what kind of indicators or data sources would be available for that.
Yeah, there's a couple that we can consider in terms of energy usage and burden. So you do know that as part of this project, we were in communication with the California Energy Commission. They have been in the process of developing their own website in terms of energy equity. And so, and they have access to a huge amount of information from the utilities in terms of looking at different usage rates, other things related to affordability, that is, for example, the cost of energy relative to income in the neighborhood. So all those things could be used to better understand energy burden in terms of how it varies across neighborhoods. I'm not sure exactly where the California Energy Commission is currently in terms of their own website to put together that data. I think at the very beginning, we've talked to, we meaning CARB and CNK, talked to these other agencies in terms of how to collaborate. So where there's overlap and usefulness, in this case, energy burden, is certainly something that could be incorporated into this website. I think it's an excellent idea. The other one is that we've been working with our colleagues at the Luskin Center for Innovation, looking at how issues of difficulty of paying utility bills. And so there's a huge amount of variation in terms of accounts that are behind. And there's a huge concern about that. From a data point of view, we have used that to try to understand which neighborhoods are overly burdened, as indicated by the proportion of accounts that are behind, and behind by how much. So that's another indicator of sort of the burden. And finally, within the American Community Survey, there is some information about utility costs, although we haven't looked at it in great detail. Something that's related to it, but maybe related to travel indirectly in terms of remote work. remote learning is access to technologies, computers, broadband, and that's also available. So yes, I think there are opportunities to add that, and something that I think could be put on the table if in fact there's a future iteration of this.
Thank you. I also want to note a comment from Amanda Marino who says that you can add different layers to the layer list to compare data across the different indicators. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Let's see. Brett Williams, I don't know if your question has already been answered, maybe in the chat, but if you wanted to say anything more. Okay, maybe he's not here anymore. I don't see him on the list. But yeah, I guess the question of deciding to use clean vehicle metrics in the absolute versus by vehicle count, so the share of the market versus the vehicle count. Maybe that was done at the advisory committee decision.
Yeah, so the basic data for the vehicle stock is vehicle counts by different categories of vehicles. So taking a vehicle, depending on the model, the year, and so forth, that vehicle stock is categorized into, essentially for the purpose of here, clean vehicles, clunkers, and clean vehicles, newer and older clean vehicles. So the basic data, they are reported as counts, and we had to make a couple of adjustments. The counts are by themselves has some problematic aspects. It includes, for example, in the DMV counts, commercial vehicles. So you get strange counts around the airport and so forth. And so we made some adjustments based on the American Community Survey because we're really interested in the vehicle stock for this project in terms of the vehicle stock in households. So the raw data, there are counts, but they had to be cleaned for a number of problematic aspects of it. And so what you see is our best estimate of the proportion of the household vehicle stock.
Thank you for answering that question. Muriel Strand, you had a question about how the homeless fit into the analysis. I don't know if you wanted to elaborate or if that's.
Well, just wanting to put them on the agenda because they often get overlooked. And two, my expectation is that within the next couple of decades, we're going to start to see climate refugees, not just from south of the border, but from southern states.
I think certainly technically it's not an issue about adding a data point that's related to homelessness. But as you know very well, because my colleagues actually have worked in the past in terms of the data collection of homelessness, it's very problematic in terms of how the quality of the data. Besides being problematic is that the locations vary quickly, often over time, depending on public policy as well as other factors. So technically, is it possible taking some of the data that's available in the homeless count and adding that as a layer? Yes. But I would also say one needs to be a little careful with data because the way we collect the data, as well as the underlying dynamics, you're right about that. There's a good chance that the homeless population may increase dramatically, partly because of climate change, partly also we don't know the impact of the pandemic in terms of people being behind on rent and being behind on mortgage. We do know from the Pulse survey, those numbers are pretty large. So, and we also know from some of the programs to try to assist renters and people who are behind the mortgage, they are a substantial number. So those things change rapidly. And that's one of the challenges of this sort of data portal is some of the indicators don't change quickly. For example, the built environment does change, but it doesn't change quickly in the same way that some of the things such as the location of homelessness could change quickly.
Right, I understand it's a big challenge. I just don't like seeing them be forgotten.
I don't think they're forgotten. We've done, I mean, I can't speak for CARB, but at CNK, that's one of the things that we're concerned about.
Thank you for raising the issue, Miro. Alejandro Huerta, you have a good question. So can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Technical assistance provider with SGC on the ASIC program and also TCC. Just curious, does this mapping tool show any connection to public transit networks and how that affects VMT? And the larger question is, does this mapping tool help us at all kind of figure out what are the best GHG reduction strategies that the state should be undertaking as it relates to public transit specifically?
Yes, there is a indicator of access to high quality transit. You could read the definition. Yeah, there's different definition of what we mean by high quality transit. The conceptually is straightforward. You know, it's frequent, right? And it's nearby. How you operationalize it, you know, that's a matter of choice and what seems to be reasonable. So you could read about how we constructed our high quality transit location index. It was a bit of a challenge because unfortunately not all public agencies, transit agencies, report their information. So we actually, besides what's known as GTFS, the standard Google formatted schedule, that, you know, there are agencies we had to manually include. So we do have a indicator of high quality transit, fairly consistent with some of the way the state's defining high quality transit locations. So yes, that's in there. How it affects VMT, that's certainly research that could be done and should be done. We do know, for example, from research that it's been done so far, is that neighborhoods with high quality transit tends to have fewer vehicles. Whether it's self-selection of people who don't want vehicles in these neighborhoods versus that the transit lowers the number of vehicles, we don't know. I mean, there's a issue of pulling apart the causality. It is an important question in terms of understanding, you know, that. Even if it's just self-selection, that people who want fewer vehicles move here, that's not bad. You know, you need to create the infrastructure for them to allow them to practice their preference. You know, if you don't have enough high transit locations, people may want to move to those locations, but if they don't exist, then they can't, you know, lower their use and dependency on cars. So that's certainly a research topic that this type of data, along with other types of data, transit service is not the only factor that affects VMT. It's how far you have to travel for your shopping, for socializing, for work, and so forth. And so you have to factor in those sort of characteristics also. But it's an important question.
Thanks. Do you know of anyone doing that research, kind of like on the GHG carbon footprint overlay on this data?
The three examples includes VMT. So I'm sure there are others doing it, but we certainly are doing it. We're making use of the data we created for this project. I think this project allows researchers to move forward in a much more detailed way. For example, the VMT data that people have been using is all simulated before this. It was actually based on parameters from Chicago. And so they're making the best simulated estimates of that. In our report, we actually talk about comparing our data, which is based on actual observations, versus this sort of simulated VMT. So I think with better data, we're going to be better able to answer the types of questions you're talking about. So I'm sure there are other researchers working on this. We are taking advantage of the data that's been created through this project to get more precise ways of understanding the patterns.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mhm.
And I will also say that, identifying the GHG impacts of transit is an area that CARB is really interested in. And so I think over time we've contributed funding to that topic area, and we'll continue to do so over time. And it's complex. I have two questions that I like to finish with. One is from Colin Weigel. Apologies for mispronouncing your last name again.
Hi, thank you. A great presentation. So the indicators that you have in the tool are likely both have causal and correlational relationships with transportation inequity. From your review, can you highlight indicators that stand out to you as primary causal components to transportation inequity?
Okay, so clearly difference in transportation resources is deeply embedded in larger structures. And so income is a primary driver. Employment income, how you generate your income. So there's a huge correlation both spatially and if we have individual records that travel patterns, vehicle ownership, what you have access to, all correlate with income. But income itself has disparities. Some of it based on things such as inequality in education, some of it based on discrimination. But there are other causal factors. For example, the costs of travel or having the ability to travel varies across neighborhoods. In our own research, for example, when we look at insurance premiums, again, for the same coverage, for the same driving record, for the same vehicle, it could vary as much as by a factor of 2. And so particularly if you have low income, that becomes a huge barrier in terms of lending practices and interest rates. Again, we see huge differences across neighborhoods. And that, again, is a barrier to that. In terms of public transit, there is, as you sort of mentioned, difficulty of unraveling the causality. But if you are relying on public transit, we know that it has a consequence in terms of the reach, the set of opportunities you have available. What's the cause of access to public transportation? It's very complicated. Again, partly the self-selection going on and your ability to pay for it. I think one of the major challenges as we move forward to try to enhance high quality transit is that we are facing a feedback in terms of gentrification. And we certainly see that here in Los Angeles. My colleague, Professor Sedaris, and I, along with our colleagues in Berkeley, we did a project for CARB on how enhancing public transit could have a negative feedback on those who most need it. That is, they get displaced through gentrification. So you might also want to look at that report.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
The last question was going to be about bikeways, since there was a lot of comments in that vein. Lyndon Price is no longer with us, so maybe, Paul, if you can just talk about any analysis, looking at the existence of bikeways versus utilitarian biking.
I fully agree. Yes, race is a very important factor in terms of access to bikeways. Partly, it's directly embedded within residential patterns and segregated residential patterns, where people of color tends to be highly concentrated in neighborhoods with very few bikeways. Part of it is political. That is, the city they live in may have different ability and willingness to enhance their bikeway. And that, again, is embedded within the racial patterns of housing. So I very much agree with that. I think one of the challenges in terms of understanding the racial differences, there are two. One is purely analytical and technical. That is, it's important to figure out if we see racial differences, is it due to racism or is it due to a more complex process that's correlated with race? In some ways, if we deal with racial disparities, maybe those are fine points that don't need to be articulated. But if you're thinking about developing policies and programs, I think it's important to understand that causality, the strength of those causalities. I think one of the biggest challenges we have, and we ran into this in our discussion with both CARB and the California Energy Commission, is that we have Proposition 209 here in California, which makes it very difficult for state agencies to figure out what they can and cannot do in terms of both talking about race and having policies and programs that address race, because there's Proposition 209 limits the ability of states to have race-oriented policies and programs. My position is that, at least from the analytical point of view, understanding the nature of the problem, Proposition 209 doesn't prohibit state agencies from doing that, to understand how race plays out in terms of transportation disparities, health disparities, energy disparities. Those are all important for us to understand. How we then incorporate that into policies and programs, that's the major challenge. So I sympathize and understand the sort of challenges faced by public agencies. I have advised them that we can do this analytical work and look at racial disparities. And certainly we include in this data set information on race. That being said, I think more could be done in terms of addressing the racial disparities that we see in our society. That's sort of my opinion of things. And I should say it's my opinion. I do not speak for any state agency.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank everyone for attending, asking questions, and of course the research team for all their work and the seminar presentation. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will be sending an email to everybody once the recording is posted with the links to all the documents again, so that they're easily accessible. Thank you so much, and it is really useful work. We appreciate it.
Thank you.